You tuned in live to Credible Conversations podcast.
Hey everybody, I'm Angela Rye. I'm here with Northwest Credible Messengers having a credible conversation with some incredible people.
AKEE Ali is who I be, also known as Kimi Casanova, and I want you to bring your asses over to listen to me have a credible conversation with Northwest Credible Messengers.
And my name is D. Smoke. I'm from Inglewood, California, and you are watching Credible Conversations.
Welcome back to Credible Conversations. I am your host, Jason Clark, and I'm here today with the Honorable Judge David Keenan.
I'm going to change my title to that.
It's kind of like that, let's get ready to rumble, Judge Keenan.
That could be my announcement when I come into court going forward.
Come on. Hey, look, if you need somebody, go ahead and just hire me, Judge. I'm looking for some gigs. I thought it was a really powerful thing to have, a transformative judge like yourself come in and just have some dialogue. Credible Messengers is really just a podcast focused on like what wellness and healing looks like in our communities. And it's imperative for us to have system and community leaders who are doing transformative work, right? Really dope stuff in our communities. Share the message, right? So we kind of want to get to know who you are, like what's your role like? What are the transformational things that you're doing? What does wellness look like in your life? You know what I mean?
Sure.
And then kind of maybe some legacy pieces, right? I know in the position that you're in, it's a really powerful position, and I know you're using that power to make transformations in our communities. And we just really want the community to get to know who you are, right? The projects that you're working on. Is there a way to, have community and court collaborations, things like that? Right. So you ready for today?
I'm ready.
Come on. I appreciate that. So let's start with this, like just giving people a chance to get to know who you are. Who is Judge Keenan? What was your upbringing like?
That's a great question. And so today I'm a judge, right? I'm the chief judge of the Mailing Regional Justice Center in Kent.
Huge.
And so I'm walking into a court every day as a judge. But I think it's important to note that the first time I ever set foot inside of a King County Superior Court courtroom, it was as a juvenile respondent, court in Seattle.
So you were being adjudicated?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And that was probably, it was throughout the early 80s, which were my early teens. And really that was consistent with my family.
Okay.
Because I keep a newspaper clipping, and you know what, I should have brought it with me today, but I keep a newspaper clipping in my chambers.
Just a reminder of how far you've come?
Well, it's not about me. It's about my mother.
Okay.
It describes a 17-year-old girl, 4 months pregnant, who was a runaway, and the article, it's from 1968. It says she wept during her whole court hearing. She was in juvenile court in King County in 1968.
Okay.
That was my mother. She cried during her whole court hearing, and it just reminds me of what it's like to be in court. And then by the early 80s, she was taking me to court.
Early 80s taking you to court. Yeah. Overcoming that, what was that like? I think just thinking of like coming into contact with the court, right? You know a little bit about my story. Like I worked for King County Superior Court for 4 years. And it was a really, good experience to kind of see what it was like being in a system. But like you, my first contact with that system was being sentenced to prison by King County Superior Court. And I think about the work that I do, and I always wonder, like, what other people's experience was like. So, like, having come into contact with the system at such a young age, and then, seeing what happened with your mom, keeping those clippings, like, what was the aspiration that, drew you into pursuing legal work and becoming a judge, like getting on the bench?
Sure. I think the first thing, we can just back up for a moment and just say, it helps to be white.
Ooh.
Right?
Hey, thank you for that acknowledgement.
That's important. And the reason I say that, Jason, is that I get asked to tell my story a lot, and people love a good story like that story of overcoming, that story of transformation. And this kid grew up with a tough time, and now he's doing great, and he's a judge. But I think it's always important to point out that I had a lot less to overcome.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, because even now, black young people in King County are vastly overrepresented
in the juvenile justice
King County juvenile court, exactly. Yeah. And so my experience is different than black people's experience. And so I can go around and saying I'm so proud of having been arrested and gone to juvenile court, I'm so proud of having dropped out of high school and got my GED. I mean, I was kicked out of Garfield High School in Seattle in 1987 as a sophomore and never went back. And I can tell those stories with pride, but it's a lot easier because of my race, because of my gender.
Yeah.
And so that story of overcoming or transforming, you know, I think I was around long enough to get enough second chances to where something finally took hold.
Okay.
And I always like to say that second chances for many people are a myth, because you can't get a second chance if you weren't born with a first chance.
Ooh, that's
right?
heavy.
And so I think particularly for people of color in our community, people who live in poverty, people with disabilities, members of our LGBTQ plus community, they might not have had a first chance, so they can't get that second chance. I was born with a bucket of chances, even though I grew up in poverty. And so eventually something took hold, and I took my GED exam at North Seattle Community College, probably like 1988, 1989, and the exam went really well. And somebody at the college wrote me a letter and said, your scores on the GED exam were remarkable.
That's what's up.
You should go to college. And so I started working. I was working full-time in a fast food restaurant, Jack in the Box, 85th and Aurora in North Seattle.
I thought you were going to say Dick's.
No, I wish it paid better, better benefits. But I was working at Jack in the Box, 85th and Aurora. I was living with my mother on a Section 8 housing voucher and a welfare check and food stamps behind a motel just off of Aurora.
Okay.
And going to college really helped.
Where did you go?
Well, I worked my way through North Seattle Community College, and then I went to the University of Washington. I left UW as a senior, finished my undergraduate degree while working full-time in San Diego. And I earned my law degree while I was working full-time. And I think a lot of people are surprised to find out that I spent almost 15 years as a federal law enforcement agent. And
So you were a Fed.
I was a Fed.
Federally.
And, you know, I had this idea that I wanted to help people, and at some point I got an idea that I wanted to be a police officer. And part of it was that I was with my mother in 1978 in Lake Forest Park, so in North King County, when we were pulled over because we had expired license tags, because my mom didn't have money for those tags. And turns out she had a warrant. And so she was arrested, and we were both taken to the police station. We're both crying. I'm 8 years old, right? I don't know what's going on. And so I was really afraid of the police. And at some point I decided I wanted to be on that side of things so that I could be the one trying to deal with folks in our community and have them not be afraid. So I decided I want to be a police officer. I applied to this program with the Seattle Police as a teenager where you could volunteer, and they said no. We don't take high school dropouts with juvenile arrest records.
Yeah.
My mother, may she rest in peace, she died in 2024. She called the head of that program, a police officer named Joe Nicholas, begged him to take me. He said, I want to talk with him. I took the number 6 bus down Aurora to the Seattle Center, which is where his office was. He gave me a cup of coffee. This is maybe 1987 or something like that. And he said, I don't normally take chances on kids like you, kids like who dropped out of high school, been arrested, but I'm going to give you a chance. And I thrived in that program. It was the first time an adult had ever shown any faith in me, seen anything in me. And totally changed my life, and it is why to this day, and I was the pallbearer at that officer's funeral about a year or so ago.
Okay.
And it's why to this day I never turn down a request for a cup of coffee, for a Zoom, for a chat, for a meeting.
For a podcast?
For a podcast. People just cold email me at the court. They message me on Facebook. They message me on Instagram. They message me on LinkedIn. They hit me up on X. And like, you don't know me, but I read about you, and I'm like, yeah, I'll meet with you, because you just never know. You might be a difference for somebody.
I heard a lot of experience, right? And when you think of that, there's probably some trauma, some tragedy in there. But even thinking of the way that some of those people you described in the story treated you, right? Some of it was wrong. Some of it was really powerful. It makes me think of, justice, right? I know as a judge, there's a lot of probably procedural justice in the lens and the way that you operate. But what would you say, in all of these experiences that you've had, is justice? And what's the definition that you live by?
I think about this a lot. And part of it is that somebody have all the resources that they need, not just because I think when we talk about justice, people just think of court, what happens in court.
Exactly.
I am very interested in what happens upstream in the community and in your personal life, even before you are a member of the community, even before you're out there in community. And so I think about somebody who every step of the way from the moment they are born is fully resourced so that they can be heard, they can be understood, and have a meaningful say in everything that happens to them. So in court, when somebody is charged with a crime, for example, I think that means they have all the resources that they need to receive a fair trial, a fair hearing. They have access to sources of proof, that they are able to achieve pretrial release if they're charged with a crime. If it's a civil case, that they have somebody to represent them. I think a lot of folks don't realize, some of us are familiar, either personally like you and I, because we've been read our Miranda rights, or just from television to movies, that you have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you by the state. I think a lot of folks don't realize that in civil cases, so cases not involving crimes, you're often not entitled to an appointed lawyer. So if you're in a family law case facing the loss of your child or your home, for example, or it could be maybe you're facing the loss of your home in a foreclosure case, you're not entitled to a lawyer in many of those cases. And so civil legal aid is also really important because otherwise all of these folks are out there trying to represent themselves or not vindicate their rights.
That's powerful. Resources, making sure people are resourced. Kind of makes me think of some of the work that you're doing with juvenile justice. What is you're the chair of?
Sure. So right now I co-chair the Juvenile Justice Committee for the State Supreme Court's Minority and Justice Commission.
So thinking of people being resourced and you being the co-chair there, right? That's a huge responsibility. Resources, it makes me think of what are some of the ways that you think community or even some of the folks listening could get more involved and support the work that's happening there? Sure,
it's a great question. And if I could spend a minute breaking it down.
Please, come on, break it on down.
I think about the schema that I use, the framework that I use is, we hear about the school to prison pipeline.
All the time.
I don't use that term typically. I use the term birth to prison machine because...
You're going to break it down, though.
Yeah, I'm going to break it down.
Okay, because that was a new one.
Because when we think about the school to prison pipeline, such a huge problem is racism. And when I say racism, I mean interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. And so that doesn't start in school. It starts when you're born a person of color. And when I say machine, I mean the system is really, in some cases, set up, not intentionally always, but to produce these outcomes. And so when we call it a pipeline, it makes it sound like it's some sort of an accident.
Yes.
And I think about upstream solutions every step of the way. And I'll give you some concrete examples if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So
I think that would be beautiful. A lot of people want to hear about them.
So I think about organizations. I'll just use organizations that I've been involved with over the years.
Yep.
So I was on the board of directors many years for an organization called Friends of the Children. They have a Seattle chapter. They're based at Rainier and Genesee. I live in Columbia City. They're just a few blocks from my house. If you know where the Ezels is at Rainier and Genesee, they're next to the Ezels. Okay. All right. And that is long-term mentoring for young people, often starting in kindergarten. And they take cohorts of young people, often starting in kindergarten, many of whom are foster kids, many of whom they've been in kinship care, they've been in foster care, they're born to a person of color, maybe they have a parent who's incarcerated, for example, they're living with a grandparent. And we can look at those children and say, because of all of these factors, they are at greater risk for early parenting, right, becoming like a teenage parent, dropping out of high school, juvenile criminal legal system involvement, and substance use disorder. And that organization commits to spending 4 hours a week with a mentor that they call a friend. That's where the name comes from, for 12 years. And
12 years.
12 years. And so they use paid
man.
full-time mentors. They don't use volunteers.
Okay.
Right?
That's what's up, because a lot of these programs aren't sustainable because either they don't have the right budget or they're volunteers.
Yeah, and it's it's hard for any volunteer to make that kind of a commitment.
12 years is a lot.
But there have been longitudinal studies on that kind of one-on-one mentoring, right? Because I think there's data out there that says if a young person has one caring, consistent adult in their life, it makes such a huge difference. And so I mention that only because your listeners, if they're thinking about how to get involved, be a caring adult in somebody's life, be a consistent presence in somebody's life. And it could be through board service, it could be through working in an organization like that, it could be through volunteering, but showing up. So I'm always thinking upstream. So we're talking kindergartners, right? I don't see kindergartners in court, thankfully. But then the next step is intervention in schools, because being born a young person of color, being born black, for example, being born into poverty, into foster care, is correlated with higher juvenile criminal legal system involvement, juvenile justice system involvement. But so is out-of-school suspensions. And so I serve on the board of Choose 180, and we have programming in schools that helps people avoid out-of-school suspensions, because that is correlated with juvenile criminal legal system, juvenile justice system involvement. And then beyond that, and I'll try to wrap it up, beyond that, with Choose 180, it's pre-filing diversion, and I know you're familiar with how that works, right? So this program, people are surprised to know, started in the prosecutor's office. Dan Satterberg and a group of black clergy, like Doug Wheeler, may he rest in peace, right? Alan Belton helped start this organization, and then I was a founding board member when it became a nonprofit. But it started in the prosecutor's office, and the idea was we could charge this young person, this juvenile. We won't if they go through this program, 180, meaning complete turnaround in your life, switch directions, hear from credible messengers, people in the community who've done their own 180s. But the idea, and what I'm getting at is we want all of these interventions to be in the community. We don't, right? Nobody is coming to court in the first instance because they think that's the best place for them. Yeah. Right? Court has a role. But if we can do things before court, right? And so then after that, if somebody is charged into court, then we're talking about post-filing adjudication. I know you know what that means, right? And so somebody has been charged into juvenile court.
So before look, I don't want to cut you off.
No,
right?
please do.
So not to block your wisdom, but just for people listening, can you break down pre-adjudication and post-adjudication?
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea with pre is you're not charged into court, right? And so for a young person, because I think people are surprised sometimes when they hear that a lot of people are charged into court, both in adult court and juvenile court. The case is eventually dismissed. But that charge still shows up in the records, right? Yeah. That arrest, if there was an arrest, still shows up in the records. And that in itself can be harmful. And so if you can avoid bringing a person into the system, that's preferable, right? And then I think about it as detours and off-ramps, right? A detour is we could charge you, but we won't, right? A detour might be a police officer who says, I could arrest you, but they've exercised the discretion not to. Because when we think about actors in the criminal justice system that have the power, people are like, well, Judge Keenan, you're a judge, you have all the power.
I've got the power.
I like that song. I'm 55 years old. I'm familiar with that music. But I think people are surprised that I have some power, but the folks with the most discretion in the juvenile justice system and the adult criminal justice system,
prosecuting attorneys,
well, and cops,
okay,
right, cops and prosecutors, because a cop decides whether to make an arrest, refer, a prosecutor decides whether to charge somebody, right, and they all have their role. But when it gets to me, they're already in the system. I can't choose whether or not they're, I couldn't choose to bring them into the system. And so it's cops and prosecutors that have access to a lot of the detours. As a judge, I have access to some of the off-ramps, meaning you're in the system, is there a way to get you out of the system without incarceration, for example? And then I have thoughts as well about what happens if you do go and serve a sentence, a disposition, in what we call in the juvenile criminal legal system, juvenile justice system, locally, like at the Clark Children and Family Justice Center in Seattle, or if you go to JR, Juvenile Rehabilitation, in the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and you might go to Echo Glen, you might go to Green Hill down in Chehalis. I have visited Green Hill 3 times in the last 14 months.
Okay.
I was down there just a couple of months ago, and it's tough. It's tough. There's some stories down there.
Yeah.
And they've got some challenges there. They're working on them. But I'm just always thinking upstream. I think people are surprised, like, we're a judge, you should be focused on the court. And I am, but I want to change the inputs, right? There are cases that we hope we can solve in the community. We talk about therapeutic courts, drug court, regional veterans court, mental health court, and those are all really important. But in the first instance, if you ask somebody who was just in the community and struggling with substance use disorder or struggling with their mental health, for example, or a veteran who was struggling, if you ask them, where should I go to get therapy, you wouldn't say, you should get arrested and go to court.
No,
not at all. You should get arrested and go to jail, right?
But far too often, right, that adjudication comes with the funding to be able to provide those services.
Right.
Yeah.
And isn't that interesting, right? This is a conversation I have with folks in the community.
Is it broken or is it by design?
Well, maybe it's both,
Okay.
right? And the reason I say that is, and I go and speak at schools, and I've spoken with grade schoolers, middle schoolers, high schoolers, college, law school, you name it. And I always tell them, don't let anybody ever tell you that there's no money for these upstream programs in the community. There's money in the system, but it is deployed downstream. It's exceptionally expensive to incarcerate a juvenile in locally, like in the Clark Children and Family Justice Center or in JR. And I want to be clear, the folks who work in those systems, juvenile probation counselors, the folks who work at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families and juvenile rehabilitation, they work really hard. And I've met many of them, and they have powerful stories, and they've shared with me how much they care about young people. But it's extraordinarily expensive to provide that level of supervision and care. And so there is this question about, well, could we redeploy those funds into the community? I wrote an opinion piece in the Seattle Times about a year or so ago, and my opinion at that time was, we need to fund everything right now. We need more funding for the upstream solutions, the midstream solutions, meaning stuff in and around court, and the downstream stuff, which is meaning stuff around incarceration. And that
we can't leave out reentry.
Yeah, and reentry. But it was controversial because I said we need more funding for juvenile rehabilitation, which is where young people are being incarcerated. But I said that because right now we can't ignore the reality that JR, especially at Green Hill, is overcrowded.
Yeah.
And those young people aren't going to get out.
And that's the reason why they opened Harbor Heights.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was controversial, but and you can talk to some of my colleagues about this, the young folks at Harbor Heights, some of them have gone there and said, we like it here. We don't want to go back to Green Hill. It's peaceful here. But I do think something has to be done to alleviate the overcrowding at Green Hill. And right now,
have you been to Harbor Heights yet?
I haven't been to Harbor Heights.
We've actually had the opportunity for the last 6 months to have credible messenger peers in the institution.
Yeah.
So,
and what do you think?
Transformational.
Yeah.
I'll say this: the Department of Children, Youth, and Families kind of says Echo Glen School, right? Green Hill School. And no disrespect to them, they're not schools.
Sure.
When you go to Harbor Heights, the environment is different, right? There's different healing processes that are built in. Young people have a lot more trust and autonomy, right? And I think when you treat people like at Harbor Heights, when you treat young people like humans and with respect, this is a completely different outcome.
Right.
I'll say in the first 6 months, no incidents of violence, right? What institution do you know has that same track record?
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And it's what I'd like to see is to have some of those models maybe duplicated throughout JR, throughout juvenile rehabilitation with DCYF, but it's again, what was controversial about the stance that I took is, people were saying, Keenan, what are you doing? You're advocating for more support for incarceration. And I said, no, what I'm saying is we should be investing heavily in those upstream and midstream solutions and the detours and the off-ramps that I talked about, including off-ramps out of JR, like the Youth Hope Act, which has not passed, but which is a path out of places like Green Hill before somebody goes to the Department of Corrections if they're serving a sentence that takes them into DOC. But I said right now, we also have to reckon with, we have to deal with the fact that Green Hill is way overcrowded and those young people aren't going to just be released. And so how can we support them and the people at DCYF who work with them in the interim with the idea that those upstream solutions eventually take hold and we've lessened the stream into JR. Then that overcrowding is cut off upstream. But right now, it's always this binary discussion. And
one or the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we can either just let everybody go and not charge anybody with crimes and not let young people just run the streets and commit crimes, or we can arrest and lock everybody up. And I say I reject that distinction.
I don't think it's really black and white, right? One of the things that I think is like there's going to be a carceral system.
Right.
So my belief is, why don't we treat that system different?
Right.
And when I say different, it might even be controversial for me to say this, but it's like you have to think, okay, you go to prison, and we traditionally understand like the environment in a prison setting. You know what I mean? And a lot of people have the idea they've been there and it's been a horrible experience. They've seen it on TV. But when you go into these institutions, right, like there's a feeling that comes with it. You're away from your community in a rural area, right? So you're homesick. You got a lot of emotions going on, maybe some mental health issues. And oftentimes, with overcrowding, you don't have the opportunity for programming.
Correct.
So you're not getting the rehabilitation that you need.
That's been the case at Green Hill.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that we have to think of is, residents, right, and staff. Because you got to think, too, staff are going to prison 5 days out of the week. So how do we kind of have this dual approach? Right. And I think it's rooted in healing. Like, how do we support the staff in healing and wellness so they can show up in their best self to support those young people who are definitely in need of somebody to be present? So that's the way that we've approached things. But I think for us, it's more of those healing modalities for young people and then preparing them for reentry, right? Connect them to a counselor while they're in the institution. Give them some of those opportunities to build strong connections with people who come from their communities, who can mentor them through the process. But start working on what reentry looks like the day that they get there.
Completely.
And on the back end, making sure that we have those resources for staff, because it can be an overwhelming job, right, for whatever reason. But I think that if we treat staff and residents with the same care and concern, it transforms those environments. It's kind of something like what's happening right now at Harbor Heights, right?
Yeah, and I agree. And the first time I visited Green Hill, which was maybe not quite a year and a half ago, we got a chance to meet with some of the young people that were incarcerated there. And I thought, well, maybe DCYF is going to just put up their best and brightest and we're going to get some sort of a show. But that wasn't the case. They shared with us their concerns. They were very candid. I felt that they were candid. But they also said, we feel like the staff cares about us here. And then I got a chance to meet with the staff, and same thing. I think they shared with us their concerns, because I was on a tour with other judges. Shared with us their concerns, what they thought was working, what they thought wasn't working. But they said, we're so overcrowded that, this was about a year or more than a year ago, that we're so overcrowded that the young people are locked down most of the time. We brought in the Department of Corrections, emergency response team because of fights and things like that, so they're not getting that programming. But the staff wanted to provide that programming. And when I was there more recently, they had gotten more support, and so they were getting more programming. And the young people said that they noticed that. And just on that reentry point, when you talk with a lay person, I think some of them understand, some don't. They'll say, well, person committed a crime, lock them up, throw away the key, treat them harshly, don't coddle them, don't let them have television, don't let them have this. But I always remind folks that it's pretty rare that somebody is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In other words, over 90% of the people that I as a judge send to incarceration coming back to the community.
Yeah. And
I always ask, when I'm having a conversation with somebody, I always ask, well, what do you want from them when they come back to the community. Like, well, I don't want them to commit any more crimes. Well, great. So how are we going to do that, right? And one way is while they are incarcerated, they are treated with humanity, that they maintain ties with family if they can, with community, that they have access to employment, to education, to health care, to credit when they come out, so that they're set up for success, right? Because when you come out of prison, for example, having been convicted of a felony, especially if you're a person of color, you've already got tremendous disadvantages in accessing employment, education, healthcare, credit, housing.
I got fired from Value Village.
Yes, exactly.
I knew I was better than that.
And so, I just ask folks, well, okay, well, you don't want them working around you or your family or whatever, but well, then what are we going to do to make sure this person is supported? Because it's an investment, right? It's an investment in our community and the safety of our community when we support people in reentry, because I just tell folks, these individuals are coming back to our community from a period of incarceration, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Right? That is a decision that the legislature has made in terms of punishment, that the prosecutors have made, that the judges have made.
Yeah. And I think a sentence should end when the time ends, to be honest with you. Like, that's one of the things that we need to be more transformational with.
Right.
It's like we don't have to continually punish people. When they've served their time, right? Everybody deserves that, that sense of justice.
That finality, and I understand that there is a need often for some sort of post-trial supervision, community supervision, and things like that. It depends on what the crime was. But, one issue, and this is an area where I've done a lot of work over the years, is legal financial obligations. So fines, fees, costs, restitution imposed on a person in a criminal case, because most of the folks can't afford to pay those, because over 75% of the people that I see in court are indigent. That's a legal term. It just means that they're poor, right? That they qualify for a public defender. They can't afford their own lawyer.
Yeah.
And I think people...
Was that like a 12% interest rate on LFOs too?
Yes, there is a 12% interest rate. It's among the highest in the United States. Now, I do want to say, when it comes to restitution, for example, intuitively, I think people in the community and even people charged with crimes, and me as well, understand that, for example, if I steal someone's car and I wreck it, and then that person is out of a car, and then I'm convicted of having stolen that car, I understand why it makes sense to order that the person who stole and wrecked that car should pay for that car, right? And I get that, and so I'm in favor of restitution. What is hard is, in most cases, the person who is sentenced to restitution can't afford to pay it. And so it's this question of, well, what do we do about that? We changed the law a few years ago to give judges discretion to not impose that interest. But I also understand why that interest rate is important to some people. To a person who has been harmed and would say, I'm out this car, they should be paying interest on this as well. The reality, unfortunately, is that few individuals, few victims ever see much of that
restitution.
Money. Yeah. There are other things where it can be quite costly to be convicted of a crime that we're working on avoiding those costs. But I do want to add, I don't want to lose sight of the victims in this in these conversations, because, for example, money from the crime victim penalty assessment, which is now funded from the general fund in the legislature. It used to be funded in part through something that we imposed on a defendant when they were convicted. That stable source of funding is really important because it helps pay for advocates. And as the chief judge in Kent in the Mailing Regional Justice Center right now, I hear from crime victims all the time, and they often come into court with advocates who will speak on their behalf, and that's really powerful. It's an important part of the equation for me. And so I support that funding. I think it's really important.
You got a depth and breadth of knowledge about the system. Obviously, being working your way up to a chief judge, it just makes me think of like all of the cases. Earlier, we were just kind of chit chatting when you came in, and you knew exactly how many cases you were over and what the outcomes were of those cases. I thought that was really impressive. I've never met a judge who kept track of everything so meticulously. So there's a couple things that it makes me think of, right? Like implicit bias in the system, but even more so, like, have you ever just been over a case that stuck with you, or that you just couldn't get out of your head, and then like why? Like,
Yeah.
is it still there, and why?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example, and I'll try and I'll use the word sanitize, because I don't want to talk about the specific person, but I'll just give you kind of a high level overview and maybe change a few things. But you might know that in Washington we sentence on a grid. And so, and so for a visual for our listeners, I mean, think of a grid, think of a table with columns and rows, right? With vertical columns and horizontal rows.
Point system.
Yes. Points, exactly. That's what I'm getting at. Right? I'm going to explain why in a moment. So crimes in Washington get like an offense level. And then points come from your prior convictions. Mm-hmm. And so you can look at this grid, you can look at this chart and say, the crime you committed is this serious, it's got this offense level, you have this many prior convictions, which add up to this many points, mm-hmm. And we see where those two meet, and then that decides your sentencing range, mm-hmm. 24 to 36 months, or this, because we sentence in months in the adult system and weeks in the juvenile system. And I've had many cases, but one in particular where I was sentencing someone to a very long prison term. And when I say long, I mean it was like upwards of 30 years.
Okay.
And I got as a judge at sentencing, I get a table. It's often referred to as an Appendix B. That's the label at the top and it shows their whole history, right? Every point, every conviction, every juvenile adjudication. So you could go back and the law has changed around juvenile points now, which I think is good. But at the time, a lot of these points counted towards somebody's sentence. And I looked at that, and it was like those points told that person's life story, because I got their history, and I read about how, they grew up in a single parent household, which is how I grew up. Right? I didn't know, so I grew up not knowing who my father was. Mm-hmm. I found my father through DNA by accident 4 years ago.
Oh wow!
First thing I found out about him is he had gone through the system here in King County.
Is he still alive?
Yeah, he is still alive.
Okay. And
we've developed a great relationship. Lives in California.
That's what's up.
But he had gone through the criminal justice system in King County, which means my mother, my father, and I all went through that system. So this person had grown up with a single parent, had gone to foster care, started getting involved with the juvenile justice system early on with petty stuff when I don't mean petty, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but he started stealing things, and then it was fights. And then it was drugs, and you could see, I'm just going through this table, give our listeners this visual, right? I'm working my way up from the bottom, which is when he's like 14 years old, to the top, where he's now a grown man, right? And
when you look at these appendixes, do you ever look at them from an evaluative lens, like maybe saying, there was some theft in there, but you knew like maybe he was in poverty. Was he stealing food? Was he stealing clothes?
Exactly.
Do you get in these cases, specifically with sentencing, do you get the opportunity to look from the grid and go, well, there's this period that I think was related to poverty or related, you know what I'm saying? Like
I do. It can go into my discretion, so I'll explain that. But but with the points, it just stuck with me that table, those points can tell somebody's life story.
Yeah.
And the reason this stuck with me, the reason I use this example is this was early on. I just started my 10th year as a judge this week, but this was early on in my career as a judge. And I remember looking at those points and thinking, what would have made a difference for that person at each point to where they never got another point?
Yeah.
Right, where they never got another point. And I think it's some of the things I talked about earlier when I was talking about those upstream interventions. It's like, how could we have detoured this person so that they're not facing me now looking at maybe 30 years? So I'll share with you, I wrote a play about it. The play is called Points. And I don't know that it will ever.
Where can we find the play?
Well, it's not published anywhere.
Okay.
It's just sitting in my office. But I have an idea that someday I'd love to see it staged.
Listen, we got a really creative director back there, Paul Sanders,
I know we
PSP
do.
Photography, Gravity Proof Media.
I don't think it's quite ready for prime time. I got to give it.
When you get ready, man, just hit him up. He'll help you out.
I got to give it some thought, but I felt the need to get it down on paper.
Okay.
And so I wrote a play called Points
Okay.
about this very idea. But in terms of that evaluative lens that you were talking about, I think it goes into a judge's discretion, right? So we judges in Washington have sentencing ranges, and we sometimes refer to it as the presumptive range. So you got that offense level, you've got those points, that yields a range, and let's say it's 2 to 3 years, 24 to 36 months, and so I can sentence anywhere in that range. I could sentence sometime. You'll hear defense attorneys and prosecutors use this term low end. You could sentence the 24 months. I could sentence high end. It's the 36 months. I could sentence somewhere in between 30 months, and in that little pocket there, that window, it's really my discretion. And so if there was an appeal, I would be reviewed for what they call abuse discretion, right? Was this somehow an unreasonable decision that I made? And it would be pretty rare for a judge who sentenced within the presumptive range to be reversed for abuse of discretion. Judges can also go below the bottom of that range, but you have to find substantial and compelling circumstances under the law to do that. You can also go above that range, and you also need to find those substantial and compelling circumstances. And sometimes the parties agree on a sentence below the bottom or a sentence above the top. Oftentimes they don't, but a judge has to make findings and conclusions on that. But in that range, this is what I'm getting at, I always ask, well, if I've got a range and it's just my discretion, in other words, I can just decide and I don't have to explain to anybody. If the range is 24 to 36 months and I sentence 30 months, I don't have to explain why I did that. I don't have to make a record. I don't have to say I'm sentencing the defendant to 30 months in the middle of the presumptive range yielded by the sentencing grid, and let me explain why and all the following factors. It's just my discretion. And what judges struggle with, I think, and I think this is a really interesting question that I'm very interested in, is when a judge exercises that discretion, what influences them? Is it because, to your question, they thought about, well, some of these points were during a period of poverty, foster care, any number of things.
Adversity, trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think I like to just be honest and say that informs my discretion. It could be also that I sentenced at the high end because something about the victim's experience informed my discretion. So these cases tend to be so focused on the defendant, but it's important to remember that there's a victim here.
Yeah.
And so their experiences inform my discretion as well. But yeah, those are places where that can come into consideration.
Thank you. That was a really thorough feedback on that. Earlier, I talked about cases that stuck with you. You shared that, how things come into play. Thank you for the perspective, right? I think a lot of people don't understand where those sentencing ranges or the sentences come from, so that's kind of insightful. And it's not necessarily something that, the average person really has access to.
Sure.
But I think of all of these things too, and I think sometimes implicit bias, right? Like you shared some of your history and experiences, and I think that there were some experiences in there that, are non-traditional for somebody in your position, right? Or somebody that has the power that you have in the judicial system. And I would say, having worked for Superior Court, right, I did feel like I was dabbling my toe in the stream of white supremacy from time to time, right? And sometimes I was like, ooh, I might get swept away. Wasn't for me, not knocking anybody for staying, but after 4 years, I felt like I was ready for something new. And that was 4 years of near perfect performance evaluations, right? So it wasn't a bad situation, but it was just a step on my leadership ladder, right? Thinking about implicit bias in the system, right? You talked about upstream, which I really appreciate because there's implicit bias in every step of the way, every system before young people or adults arrive at the judicial system. But thinking about the courtroom, right? Because this is the imperative piece, and that's where you sit. How do you feel about implicit bias in the courtroom, and what can be done about it?
Sure. Thank you for that
Yeah.
question. So, there are 56 Superior Court judges in King County, and I think they're all really dedicated to working on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we have some training in some of these issues for all the judges in my court this Monday. And we do a lot of that training. It's really important. And starting this year, I'm going to be helping teach this topic at the State Judicial College, which is where new judges go, usually at the beginning of the year when they become a new judge. So these are things that we're reckoning with.
That's judges in like municipal and district courts too.
Superior Court of Appeals, and even the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And so this is something that the courts, I think, are very committed to tackling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something I give a presentation each year at the University of Washington School of Law to all the new law students called The Promise and Peril of a Legal Education, where I talk about the history of interpersonal and institutional and systemic racism in the courts in Washington, and I talk about really troubling Washington Supreme Court decisions historically, and because we're trying to get folks early in their legal careers. And so when we talk about the system, I don't think my colleagues or any of us are set out to say we want to join a racist system, right? I think we've joined the system because we think we can achieve justice in the system.
Yeah.
And on a good day, we're extracting that justice. On a bad day, we're not. And it was a real struggle for me to think about whether I wanted to come to this side. But, as I've heard Brian Stevenson speak a number of times, and I traveled to Montgomery for the opening of the Peace and Justice Memorial and heard him speak there, and he said, his words stuck with me. He said, sometimes you got to get proximate with the problem, right? And so I think my colleagues and I all joined the system because we want to serve and feel like we could make a difference.
Yeah.
But I'll give you a concrete example of how race factors in, because I think it helps to make it real. Give you an example. Think about redlining, right? This historical practice throughout the United States, but we'll just focus here in the Seattle area, here in King County. So redlining was real. Black people, and there's data on this, there's maps online, there's videos, there's projects out there. You can find this online. Talk about black people being redlined into central Seattle, the central district, the CD.
Yep.
Right. I grew up. I lived in Seattle for 52 of my 55 years.
Okay.
So individuals were redlined into the CD and often denied access to home ownerships because, for example, racially restricted deeds.
Covenants,
right.
yeah.
It said you can't sell this house, for example, to a black person, or to Jews, for example, they would use the term Hebrew, or to members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And so black people were historically denied access to be able to purchase a home. I'll give you a specific example from a talk that I give. There's a case called It Will Come to Me, but this was O'Meara. It was the O'Meara case. So this was a case decided by the Washington Supreme Court, but initially in King County, where a white couple, a Coast Guard commander named O'Meara, they put their house on the market. This was decades ago in Seattle, and a black person made a full price offer on the house. Now, putting aside the fact, today in Seattle, you make a full price offer on a house, not enough, right? You're gonna have to make 10 offers, but
Man,
right.
that's
But back in the day,
King
full
County.
price offer, that's good, right? And the O'Mearas, because the person was black, not only rejected the offer, but they said they would burn the offering papers. That's right. That's deep, right?
Damn.
That's harsh. But
That's real, though. That's reality.
That's real, right? And
Yeah.
so that case was initially brought in King County Superior Court. It made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld basically the O'Meara's decision not to sell to this black family. So that's a concrete example. I'm so interested. I think you can tell I'm making these things real. We talk about these things in the
I'm gonna research that case.
I'll send it to you.
Please, I need to
email
read
me
it.
or text me. I'll send it to
I
you.
got you.
But so that's an example. And so a black person is denied the ability to own a house. For many people in our community, their house is their greatest stored value of wealth.
Well, I think if you think of that time, like you think of redlining and FHA grants and all of this stuff. At that time, families were getting like the generational wealth to send their kids to college, and when certain people were blocked out, we didn't get the same opportunities, right? So
well, and here's a reason why it matters in the criminal justice system. One reason, at least, is black people in King County are disproportionately charged into the criminal justice system. I kept my own, and we talked about this before we started today, I kept my own data as the assistant criminal chief in the Seattle courthouse in 2024, where I did all of the arraignments, meaning all the hearings where somebody was advised of the charges against them and asked to enter a plea, usually a plea of not guilty. I kept track of the race of every person that I arraigned in 2024, 1,982 people, 35.7% of them were black. Black population in King County is around 7%, so vastly overrepresented. And so if you think about the black population in King County that we know was denied access to the stored wealth value of purchasing a home. Well, when you get arrested, what happens? They set bail, right? We have a money bail system in Washington, so you're held until you can pay an amount of money, and often people will go to a bail bonds company, and you need collateral to get that bail bond. Well, let's say your bail is $100,000, and well, what asset do I have for that collateral? My home, right? And if you are a black person who is disproportionately charged into the criminal justice system, but you were disproportionately excluded from that stored value of wealth, that is an example, right? And my colleagues and I, it's like we didn't create this system, right? A lot of us would say that the system needs to be changed.
Acknowledge it, though.
But we have to acknowledge it, right? But it's a concrete way of explaining why a racially neutral law, right, and policy and court rule, which deals with bail, right? It doesn't say black people get more bail or black people should be held longer than white people. It doesn't say anything about race at all. But you can go back in history and say this is why it matters. So that's just an example.
And when I think of implicit bias in the courtroom, it starts at the beginning, and you think of like risk assessments, right? A lot of the questions that they're asking are, inherently racist towards people who didn't have specific opportunities.
Well, this is why we talk about, because there are courts and King County is not one of them that will use risk assessment tools. And I think some people would say that they have benefits. Others would say that it's pass-through bias because you're relying on questions that are associated with things that disproportionately affect, for example, people of color. This is a discussion we're having around artificial intelligence right now, and should that be used to inform a judge's discretion in decision-making? My view is it should not.
No, that's not good.
Because the question is, well, what data was that large language model trained on?
Right? And that's it. Like the knowledge base is based off of what you feed it, and if we're feeding it racist data, then what is it going to spit out?
And I don't want to be alarmist. I really think that there are some really good things we could do with artificial intelligence in the courts around, for example, assisted research or customer service. But I think judges have been pretty universal in saying it should never be a substitute for a judge's discretion and decision making.
So I heard a lot of what you shared earlier. It was about community and like how community can get involved and the partnerships that you've had, the way that you've invested in community organizations. For the folks who are watching, how can community come closer to the courts to undo, these implicit bias instances, systems, processes?
Well, I think a lot of it is just working on the kinds of programming that I'm talking about, the upstream things. And so, I've talked a lot with friends and colleagues over the years about what does an alternate system look like, a system of justice that is rooted in community. We use this term restorative justice. And I presented at a forum on restorative justice a couple of years ago. But I hasten to add that you can't restore justice to somebody who didn't start with justice, right? And so I think many people in our community are born with disadvantages to mean they were born into injustice. And so to say, well, we're going to arrest you, bring you into the system, and then we're going to restore your justice, like, well, what are you restoring? It might be the first time I ever got justice. And so I think a lot about what are the interventions in the community. So again, I referred to this long-term mentoring model earlier. For a young person, how can we mentor them to keep them from those 4 things: early parenting, juvenile justice system involvement, substance use disorder, and dropping out of high school. But if they're in school, how can we keep them in school, help them avoid out-of-school suspensions? And so there's programming, that there's ways to volunteer. And with the courts, it's just supporting their education. It's electing judges and taking that very seriously. Judges in Washington are elected, all the way from a Seattle Municipal Court judge or a King County Superior Court judge, all the way to a Supreme Court justice. And so, unfortunately, these are what we call low information races. In other words, most voters don't know much of anything about the candidates.
That's why policy advocacy is imperative.
Yeah,
right?
Take the time to educate yourself about judicial candidates, ask questions and what they stand for. And I'm not telling people vote a particular way or vote for a judge that has a particular point of view, right? Because we use this term neutral, and judges are neutral. We're required under the Code of Judicial Conduct to be neutral, but every judge comes from someplace, and we can speak under the judicial ethics rules about issues that affect the justice system, that affect access to justice. And so we should be asking those questions. And it takes judges with all kinds of perspectives, right? Not every judge agrees with me on some of these things, and I don't agree with every judge on some things, but I think we do a good job of talking with each other and listening.
I'm glad that you all don't agree on every topic. That can be dangerous.
Well, I think so too, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so important as judges that we listen to the community and we listen to each other, right? And the community should be making their voice known, and we want to hear from the community.
I appreciate that. I think that's a huge perspective, right? There's power in unity, but there's power in community.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
Come on, man. Thinking about everything, man, you've shared a lot. You got a lot of knowledge. You got a lot of history. You've been around for a while. What would you say is your greatest accomplishment? It could be personal, professional, anything.
I think I won't pin down one thing. I'll say that maybe the thing that I do the best is I'm always asking myself, how can I do better? How can I be better? And it's an important conversation I have with myself on a daily, sometimes a moment-to-moment basis.
The
right?
mere moments are the ones, right?
Yeah, and when I was working in law enforcement, I started asking myself, is there a better way that I could show up for the community? So I started going to law school at night, working full-time during the day in law enforcement. And then as a lawyer, I worked in civil law, so worked in a large law firm, but I started doing a lot of pro bono work. So, in other words, free legal work for people around immigration, criminal cases, you name it, because I was asking myself, is there a way I could show up better for the community? And then eventually I was looking around, I was like, I'm enjoying this legal aid work more than being a lawyer for paying clients. And I started working on boards like Choose 180, like Friends of the Children, like Team Child. And in some of those organizations I could stay involved with, I had to leave the Team Child board when I became a judge because they have attorneys who appear in my court. And so I couldn't continue to serve with that organization because I might have to decide things for attorneys from that organization. But I was just always asking myself, and then at some point, after showing up enough in the community on those causes, I just kept thinking, what affected me and people close to me in my community growing up? My mother going to juvenile court in 1968.
Yeah.
Now I know my father went to adult court. I went to juvenile court. People around me, right? And how could I be that difference? And at some point, I just woke up, and I had enough people reach out to me, and I said, I think it's time to try to become a judge. And that's why I ran for election in 2016.
Come on.
And I'm always thinking about that. How can I show up better in community? For anybody who's listening, I would just encourage them, start with what affected you, your family, your friends, people close to you, your community, and then think about what's one way I can show up better for those causes. And right now, I think this is where I'm supposed to be, working in the judiciary.
Yeah.
And maybe someday it'll be something else. But I wake up every day thinking, what more do I have in terms of time and treasure, right? my time, my bandwidth, my money, whatever, and how can I deploy it to help the most people? And so I just think that's a good conversation to keep having with yourself.
That's powerful. I can relate with that. I even say that because, like, thinking about my journey, right? Like, how can I create a greater contribution to community and, you know, just the community empowerment and stuff that we're doing through Credible Messenger and the way that we're impacting, you know, schools, community,
Exactly.
other community leaders, you know. So I resonate with that. I can identify with that as well.
Well, and that credibility piece, because I love the name Credible and I love the name Messenger.
Come on.
Right? Because it's, you know, you're credible, you have trust in the community, right? And for a lot of us, we're trying to build that trust, and people understandably have reasons not to trust us, right? And it's like, who's going to be the messenger? Because there's all kinds of messengers out there. Not all of them are credible, right?
That's it. What's the message, right?
So I just appreciate so much what you and your colleagues do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That affirmation means a lot. So in closing, I got this one for you. When it's all said and done, right? What do you want your legacy to be?
You know, I don't think I'll answer that question, but I'm going to maybe, as judges and lawyers are famous for doing, I'm going to change it quite somewhat. But I don't like to think of legacy because I'm focused on what I'm doing now.
Okay.
Right? I don't like to think about, well, what am I going to leave behind? Because my view is I want to leave everything on the table.
Okay.
Right? So I'll answer it that way. I want my legacy to be that I did everything that I could until my dying breath. You know, when I spoke about that police officer, Joe Nicholas, earlier, who mentored me, and I told you I was a pallbearer at his funeral. Well, in his retirement, he was volunteering at Habitat for Humanity. He was doing things in the community. He became a deacon in the church. And I think I'm getting this correct, that, like, he preached a sermon, like, on a Sunday, and then he drove himself to the hospital and passed away.
Damn.
Right? And he left all that service
On the table.
right on the table. And I want that to be me. I want to leave a legacy of, like, I gave everything that I had, with everything, all my time, all my treasure, all my bandwidth. So I'll answer it that way.
So I'm going to close with this, right? Wellness is imperative for people doing big work, right? So think about what keeps you grounded.
Yeah.
Practice, 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 you know? So take time to recharge your batteries, Judge. You're doing a lot.
I'm trying.
Yeah.
Appreciate
I really
you.
appreciate you for coming out, man.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.